All right, so we're going to jump back in here with chapter 11. So, this is at the end of the section, the production of absolute surplus value, and we're sort of, um, to recap a little bit, chapter 10, the working day, with in relation to absolute surplus value. Um, Actually, let me just, there is a short blurb somewhere. Let me figure out the page. Oh, it's probably in chapter 12. Well, let me save that then. Okay, so absolute surplus value is just a recap. Is when you increase your surplus value by extending the length of the working day, or if the workers struggle back and you shorten it, then you're probably losing absolute surplus value. Um, so Marx in this chapter, uh, chapter 11, he sort of lays down three laws related to this, and they are basically mostly can be expressed in these formulas, or they're kind of consequences of these formulas. So the first law he mentions here is that the mass of surplus value produced equal to the amount of the variable capital advanced multiplied by the rate of surplus value. In other words, the mass of surplus value is determined by the product of the number of labor powers simultaneously exploited by a capitalist and the degree of exploitation of each individual labor power. Um, so that's, you can write that, this formula here, and here I actually kind of rewrote this, my notes here. When I switch tabs, you all can see that.
Mhm.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So first law, um, remember, just again, maybe slight review from earlier, is that rate of surplus value is S over V. So S is, this is lowercase s, I should, to be clear. Lowercase s, the surplus value of like one labor or one labor power. Also the average labor power typically is how it's used. And then lowercase v is the variable capital for one laborer. Or in other words, it's basically saying their wage. It's kind of another way of thinking of that. And I know Marx calls it a rate, which, I mean, sure. I guess you can call it a rate if you want. But to me, it makes more sense to think of this in terms of an efficiency. Um, so, like a thermodynamic efficiency, to be clear. So again, think of this as surplus labor or surplus value being, what you get out versus the variable capital, which is what you put in. That's basically how you calculate any, you know, um, thermodynamic cycles efficiency, right? Is um, you're doing a simple ratio of like how much work did you do over how much delta, how much heat did it take to achieve that. Um, so your efficiency, now in this case, one major difference between the rate of surplus value versus an efficiency, most times efficiencies can never be more than 100%, as a general rule of thumb. But in this case, your rate of surplus value can definitely be more than 100%. Right, so you can definitely be making, let's say $200 in surplus value, um, and only be only be paying your worker $100 in wages, and therefore this ratio would be 200%. So it definitely could be higher than one, or 100% rather. But yeah, again, I like to think of it in terms of like how efficient are you as a capitalist at exploiting your laborers. That's sort of how I think of it. Um, so the first law, then, I guess this was technically from earlier, but the first law is just the mass of surplus value, which is multiplying capital V by this efficiency or ratio. So capital S then is capital V times S over V. And capital N, therefore, is just little v times N being the number of laborers that you have employed. So your total variable capital is just basically all of your wages added up together. That's another way of thinking of that. So you could rewrite this to just basically be N times S. That would also kind of work. Just, little v and little v cancel. N times S is what you're left with. I think that would also give you the massive surplus value. But at the end of the day, what Marx is talking about is that typically the capitalist wants to increase capital S. That is actually, this is they're going for. Now, what we'll kind of be getting into a little bit is in their striving to increase capital S as much as possible, you're going to have some limits on your rate of exploitation or rate of surplus value here. You're going to have some limits on that you're going to have to struggle with and figure out how to get around. And then you're also going to have some limits on capital V, like how much you have to pay your workers. Because, class struggle and all that fun stuff. So yeah, the first law he talks about is basically just like a definitional law. And he tackles it early here. And he immediately jumps into one of the limits that you'll run into with this. Talking about limits here. So, I should also mention, what he talks about. I think he's somewhere in here. Yeah, here we go. A decrease in the variable capital may therefore be compensated for by a proportionate rise in the degree of exploitation of labor power, or a decrease in the number of workers employed by a proportionate extension of the working day. Let's look at our formula one more time, right? If we decrease our variable capital, or we have less variable capital to spend on labor, for example, so our capital V goes down, then our ratio here has to go up in order to compensate, to make sure we get back to the capital S that we're looking for. So we take a look at this ratio, then we can either decrease little v, meaning pay your laborers way less. But again, that has limitations, because you can't pay them nothing, which would, that's basically slavery. But at the same time, they also just wouldn't be able to afford anything to feed themselves or clothe themselves, nothing. So they wouldn't be able to reproduce or make themselves like able-bodied enough to continue doing labor. So you have to pay them some sort of bare minimum, what Marx will later on call the minimum wage, of course. So that's going to be tough, but your surplus labor or surplus value per laborer definitely can be tweaked a little bit. And he suggests here in this section that one way to do that would just be extending the working day, which again, that's absolute surplus value. I guess just to continue this paragraph, within certain limits, therefore, the supply of labor. Why can't I highlight this? Come on. Okay. Oh, this is just terrible. Whatever. Inversely, a fall in the rate of surplus value leaves the mass of surplus value, which has been produced, unaltered in the amount of the variable capital, i.e., the number of workers employed increases in the same proportion. So yeah, that's another way of doing it, right? Is if each worker is being is like not as productive, then you can simply hire more workers to kind of pick up the slack, so to speak. So there are a couple of variables in these formulas that you can tweak and use to compensate for one another, or just overall increase your big mass of surplus value at the end of the day. But the next thing he'll introduce here is, let's see. What does he say? I don't remember what he says. Yeah, basically here. Talks about the working day is obviously has a limit. So the absolute limit of the working day, this being by nature always less than 24 hours, sets an absolute limit to the compensation for a reduction of variable capital by a higher rate of surplus value, or for the decrease of a number of workers exploited by a higher degree of exploitation of labor power. Okay, so if we're the capitalist and we want to decrease, let's say decrease how many workers are working for us, but the remaining workers work much harder, and that can only work to a certain extent. I'll just get down the second law here. So he says there's a limit to the length of the working day, 24 hours long, and therefore a limit is in place due to the possibility of increasing the rate of surplus value indefinitely by extending the working day. So if your only means of increasing little s here is extending the working day, then you're going to run into an issue of you can't have your workers working 24/7. Or at least an individual worker cannot work 24/7. So if they want to decrease their workforce N and compensate by extending the working day, they can only do this to a certain extent. And he does say that like it is less than 24 hours, even though the physical limit is 24 hours just by our definition of a day. But in reality, it's actually probably quite a bit less than 24 hours because they still need to eat and sleep. And yeah, I mean, I don't know. I can't remember quite from chapter 10, like what's the longest example he gave of a working day, but probably like 16 hours or 18 hours or something insane. But even if you do work a crazy shift like that, there's almost no way you could probably do it the next day, like at least not as effectively. Yeah, and chapter 10, he does go over the shift system and explains like why that's the case, to make sure that any given worker is working like crazy hours, but you just rotate the workers in shifts to make sure that they have time to recuperate after these insane hours. So that is an option, but as Marx is laying out here, the second law basically says that even that has its limits. Okay. Actually, one right at the end here as well is pretty good. He says, big sentence. This self-evident second law is of importance for the explanation of many phenomena arising from the tendency of capital to reduce as much as possible the number of workers employed, i.e. the amount of its variable component, the part which is changed into labor power, which stands in contradiction with its other tendency to produce the greatest possible mass and surplus value. On the other hand, if the mass of labor power employed or the amount of variable capital increases, but not in proportion to the fall in the rate of surplus value, a diminution occurs in the mass of surplus value produced. So he's basically laying out that capital ends up running into this law, where they're going to be eventually forced to basically consider hiring more people, if they want to continue to increase their production capacity, pretty much. Well, we can also get into the third law, I guess, which is another interesting roadblock for capital to deal with here. Okay, or not roadblock, but an interesting complication. So, third law says that the mass of surplus value is directly proportional to the variable capital advanced. S is proportional to V, which pretty clear from our definition in the first law, which is weird. I almost think that's not even, this is the less important part of the third law. The more important part is that Marx claims that this relationship here is independent of the C over V ratio. So recall that is your constant capital over variable capital ratio, or I think he also calls it like the organic composition of capital. The other shorthand. And let's jump back. So he says that the third law results from the determination by the following two factors of the mass of surplus value. So the rate of surplus value and the amount of variable capital advanced. The rate of surplus value, or the degree of exploitation, and the value of labor power, the amount of necessary labor time being given, it is self-evident that the greater the variable capital, the greater would be the mass of the value produced and of the surplus value. So he's making one caveat here, is that if our amount of necessary labor time is given, then you would expect, just hire as many people as possible, basically. That's one thing you would expect. And sure enough, right, it makes sense that if this ratio here is a constant, then yeah, as V goes up, S goes up. Sounds easy. But then he says if the limit of the working day is given from the second law, and also the limit of its necessary part. So those are two assumptions here, but the first one is more of a fact. The second one is more of an assumption. The mass of value and surplus value produced by the individual capitalist is clearly exclusively dependent on the mass of the labor that he sets in motion. But this, on the assumptions we have made above, depends on the mass of labor power, or the number of workers he exploits, and this number in its turn is determined by the amount of variable capital advanced. With a given rate of surplus value and a given value of labor power, therefore, the masses of surplus value produced vary directly as the amounts of variable capital is advanced. Okay, we're repeating now, but that's the point. So he says, now we know that the capitalist divides his capital into two parts. One is means of production. This is the constant part. And he lays out the other as living labor power, which is the variable part. On the basis of the same mode of production, the division of capital into constant variable differs in different branches of production and within the same branches, within branches of production too, and that this changes with technical foundations, so on and so forth. But whatever the proportion between constant and variable part of a given capital is, he lays out a bunch of ratios. The law just laid down is not affected by this. For according to our previous analysis, the value of the constant capital reappears in the value of the product, but does not enter into the newly produced value or the new, so in other words, the newly created value product. Okay, so jumping ahead just real quick, the law demonstrated above therefore takes this form. The masses of value and of surplus value produced by different capitals, which is the value of labor power given and its degree of exploitation being equal. Again, that's an important assumption here. Vary directly as the amounts of the variable components of these capitals, i.e. the parts which have been turned into living labor power. Okay, so, and then he kind of already laid out the contradiction here, but he immediately says, well, this law is kind of contradictory to known experience. And what we'll kind of get into here. Yeah, so I guess I wrote the same thing in much shorter language, but basically it's like, well, how does that work? How can this ratio be independent of C over V? It doesn't seem like it would work that well. And he's kind of teasing out what we'll get to in a second which is relative surplus value. That is going to be part of, and not just relative surplus value, but also basically technology and technological innovation that increases productivity is going to be one potential way out of this contradiction for capital. So he's kind of setting up the problem, but doesn't give us a total answer yet. So that is, and then he'll also get in. So he kind of jumps into some definitions of class here, actually, which is interesting. So, as a quick review, right? Hopefully, nothing is shocking to anybody, but honestly, maybe it is a little shocking to me. How many people don't really know these definitions? Because I don't know about y'all, but like there's a lot of questions in the Theory channel and other channels just spontaneously that are like, is this profession petty bourgeois? Is this profession bourgeois? Is this, is this proletarian? It's like, it's such a headache that, I mean, it's just like artifact of, liberal brain rot, unfortunately, that like, oh, this profession is automatically in this class, or there's also just the arbitrary other way around of just saying that profession belongs in this class because I say so, or because they have like bourgeois vibes or something. I don't know. However people, I guess, approach that question. Typically, if they're approaching it in those types of ways, they are ignoring the relations to the means of production, which is Marx's definition of class. So, just like how most parts of your identity are probably some type of social relation that is socially defined and understood, meaning, right, it's something objective but not necessarily tangible. That's pretty much how class works. Class is also a social relation, and specifically, it's a relation to the means of production. So there's some general categories that we lay out here. So the proletariat or working class, they own no means of production and only has their own labor power to sell for a living. The independent workers are workers that own their own means of production, but they typically only produce for their own subsistence and maybe a small surplus on top of that. So this would probably be, at least at Marx, and maybe in our own time, we could call this sort of the peasant class, basically. So a peasant fits this definition pretty well, right? Because if they kind of have a small plot of land to themselves, they can use that for some small scale agriculture, animal husbandry, whatnot. And yeah, so that is owning your own means of production. They own their land, presumably their own tools and capability of harvesting things. And then they can just sell the products of their labor, and support themselves. And if they make a little money on the side, great. If not, so be it. And then we have one step up from that is the petty bourgeois, or what Marx calls in this chapter the small masters. And these are people who they employ a small workforce, but they also work using their own means of production. So they are both a boss and a worker at the same time. And this is not it's not like wildly unusual. I think there's actually a good number of petty bourgeois people out there. And this is where you can get some really fuzzy class allegiances, and I think this is why the petty bourgeois is often easily swayed into like especially reactionary ways of thinking, because they have some allegiances to bourgeois, like the capital B bourgeois, big capitalists, right? In the sense that they both have employees, basically, and they need to. They still have the same drive as a big capitalist, meaning like they still have to valorize um, surplus value at the end of the day. So like they still have to exploit people, but they're also have some. They can at least share perspective with the working class people because they are themselves working and producing stuff. But what the experience that they do not share is exploitation, because I would say it's pretty unlikely for a petty bourgeois person to, I don't know, like systematically underpay themselves. That I don't think is particularly common, but they're probably going to compensate themselves better than their employees typically, even if they're doing very similar work. So yeah, petty bourgeois definitely an interesting category, but I would say that for the most part, especially in the modern context, they're overwhelmingly more likely to be pro-capitalist and like align with capitalist interests politically more often than not. Which obviously brings us to the big capital C capitalist. So this is what Marx refers to as capital personified. People who purely live off of and generate wealth through the exploitation of their workers. So the implication here is that capitalists don't actually work pretty much at all. They might come up with some general plan of attack or plan of running a business, the infamous business plan. But even then, they don't actually execute any of it, right? Because as we'll get into in the chapter 13, right, capitalists hire managers and supervisors and, you know, a whole hierarchical, like almost army of little generals running around barking orders at the workers. So even the capitalists' plan and the business plan and all this, they don't actually do that themselves. they might talk like they do, but they don't really. They're just sending orders from up on high, and other people execute those orders down the line. So yeah, that's most of what we got for 11 here. I guess one more note is this observation as capital as a coercive relation, which is interesting. Actually, if I back up a little bit further, capital developed within the production process until it acquired command over labor, over self-activating labor power. In other words, the worker himself. And the capitalist, who is capital personified, there we go, now takes care that the worker does his work regularly and with the proper degree of intensity. So again, like I said, even though Marx is making it sound like the capitalist does this personally, it's rare that would be the case. He says capital also developed into a coercive relation. This compels the working class to do more work than it would be required by the narrow circle of its needs. As an agent in producing the activity of others, as an extractor of surplus labor and an exploiter of labor power, it surpasses all earlier systems of production, which were based on directly compulsory labor and its energy and quality of unbounded and ruthless activity. Yeah, so he's in this section. He does lay out some of the definitions of class, maybe familiar with, but I think he's also contrasting between previous modes of production and capitalism, kind of in this stuff. And it's, yeah, what he's basically getting at is that in previous modes of production, even if you had, I still think would be considered fairly coercive labor relationships, it would typically be, you would still have laborers doing the minimum, what the hell is the word he uses? Oh my gosh, why am I blanking so hard? This part, what's this called? Necessary labor. That word. There you go. Yeah, I think what he's getting at is that in previous modes of production, if you had a labor force and the Egyptians building the ancient pyramids, I think one example, um, they wouldn't typically make laborers work like more than was necessary. First of all, their level of development was quite low comparatively. So you would actually have to work quite a long time to, in a word, pay for your living, like pay for your food and such, because food was more difficult to get. Like agriculture wasn't as systematized. We didn't have the technology. Like gene editing wasn't a thing basically. So it was basically the workers. Yeah, they would have had to work a long time each day to kind of pay for themselves, so to speak. But rarely that excess labor time wasn't as common, and that is basically what we should think about when we talk about capital as a social relation. It's denying. It's like, yes, you're denying the means of subsistence to people through private property relations, but then you're using that specifically to make them not only work for their bread, but work way more than they need to. And if you're a capitalist, work as much as possible, more than they need to. And that's what makes it so coercive, in his words. And that he points out that this is why it has surpassed earlier systems of production. It's so much more productive as a economic system, because the social relation of capital and the drive to keep growing consistently pushes workers to do more and more and more than they are required to. And you can see, and kind of keep in mind, especially as we get into talking more about technological development. Technological development for thousands of years was quite sluggish, right? You would have either like relatively minor innovations, or new materials becoming available. So like better metal, for example, like better metalworking is like one example. Mining techniques to go get those metals underground got better, and a lot of that took a long time to develop, and that's not super surprising, because if you kind of look at like the technology curve, contrary to the Nature article I just posted, for most of history, that curve of like impactful technology would look like an exponential curve, right? You'd have thousands and hundreds of years of like kind of steady upward technological development, and then you kind of hit like this late medieval, early capitalist period. Like a lot of people point to sort of the Enlightenment as this turning point, but it also depends on where you were in the world. Um, but yeah, basically the end of the feudal period, beginning of the capitalist period is where it really starts like rocketing skyward. And what technology does almost across the board, as we'll get to a little bit, is it basically reduces this section of necessary labor. Right? How much labor does a worker need to do to sort of pay for their own existence or afford their own existence? Better technology over basically shortens the amount of time that takes, and this just kind of goes across the board. Um, I really am jumping ahead of like a little bit, but yeah, well, I mean, actually, no, that's not true. I guess let's just get to chapter 12 because why not? Um, let's talk about relative surplus value because that is basically what I'm talking about, anyways. Okay, so we have our line diagrams here, which I have recreated. So, I tried to recreate the example Marx did again, just fewer words, hopefully better pictures, some color in here. So let's say working day version 1 is 6 hours of necessary labor and 6 hours of surplus labor. Okay. Idealized simplification, but let's start with this as our baseline. Now, if we're role playing as the capitalist here, and we need to do some layoffs, and naturally with layoffs, whoever didn't get laid off is going to get fucked over time. So we have two options then, version 2 and version 3 we can use to compensate for our layoff. So version 2 here would be the absolute surplus value route. So in green, I marked here the 2 extra hours that we extended the working day. So now we have a 14-hour day, and we're assuming, just like we did in the previous chapter, we're assuming that the necessary labor time for this particular worker is the same from version 1 to version 2. The worker has to work 6 hours to pay themselves off, so to speak. So this is a total working day, I guess, is the length of AC, so 12. So extending it to 14 would effectively lengthen BC to 8 hours of surplus labor time. The other way of doing it, version 3. Now, I should also mention that version 2 here is going to piss your workers off because it's pretty overt what you're doing, right? And this will kind of hopefully reveal another theme of like the whole capital being very surreptitious and very sneaky about a lot of this stuff, is that if you just extend the working day by 2 hours, everyone knows what you're doing. It's like pretty obvious, and your workers are going to be fucking pissed, rightfully so. Especially if they're getting paid the same, right? If their wages aren't increasing, but they just straight up work longer, it's like, well, you don't need to be a mathematician to understand you're getting just straight fucked over. Like, everyone understands this. Yeah, it might achieve the goal of increasing your surplus value, but at the expense of pissing your workers off to no end. So what version 3 here is what is introduced in this chapter is relative surplus value. And so I've defined it here as the struggle over increasing the productivity of labor, which lowers the value of the means of subsistence and therefore lowers the value of labor power. So if you introduce, for example, like I said, a lot of new technologies that make labor across the board more productive, meaning in the same amount of time, a given worker with this new machine can produce more products. We know from our analysis in the earlier chapters that each of those products, the total value encapsulated in all of them is the same, which therefore means that the value of each product individually is actually less than before. I think everyone sort of intrinsically understands this, right? We kind of understand that like things that are easily mass produced tend to be pretty cheap. This is hopefully pretty uncontroversial. It's something we're all familiar with. We also understand the converse is true of things that are maybe handcrafted or, you know, carefully designed or artisanal or whatever tend to be more expensive because it took someone, usually a fewer number of people, more intensive effort to produce, and so typically that comes with a higher price. So what Marx is doing here is he's acknowledging that if this starts happening on a large scale, then from the capitalist's perspective, the amount of necessary labor time, in other words, like how much you need to pay your workers for them to be able to afford the stuff they need, is actually decreasing as your technology gets better. So if this line actually gets shortened, then those 2 hours that are no longer necessary just become surplus labor. And so we've actually achieved extending our surplus labor time to 8 hours without extending the working day at all. It's still a 12-hour day. And so this is the definition of relative surplus value. It's basically the ratio of you know, BC over AB or AB over BC or something, as opposed to BC over AC. So it's a slightly different ratio, or it's a different strategy. Basically, let's put it that way. It's a different strategy for capital to achieve the same goal, the same goal state of increasing surplus value, without actually extending the working day and pissing off their workforce. And it's more sneaky because the workforce may not be totally aware that this is happening, basically. In fact, I think he even says in here somewhere, don't know if I'll be able to find it in notes, but I think he does mention at some point, like the workers may even perceive it as a pay increase or something like that, and that might get duped.
I think David Harvey pointed out that in his lecture on this, that when the value of commodities is lowered, you can actually see an increase in the standard of living of the workers alongside the rate of increase in the rate of exploitation.
Yeah.
Up to a point. And he kind of discusses things like Walmart economies and various capitalist opinions on foreign trade and cheap goods that kind of allow them to keep wages lower while workers still perceive that their standard of living is going up because they can purchase that sort of bundle of necessary goods with the same amount or less money and feeling like, they have more left over, while in reality the employer is extracting more surplus value.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. And I think that's exactly what I was thinking of too. It's sort of the the perception from the worker's perspective is not necessarily reflecting the reality. Again, that's like one of my favorite Marx quotes is if everything were as it appeared on the surface, then there'd be no need for science, right? So if the worker's perception of like, man, our lives are getting better, this is great, we can afford more things even though our wages are stagnant, that perception, that appearance is not the full story.
And to a degree, that's where you also start seeing that divergence. If you've seen that chart about like wages stagnating and productivity continuing to increase,
right?
That is, kind of alongside a dovetailing concept, because as technology improves, you can produce more cheaply, productivity goes up, and you can, to a degree, get away with not increasing wages commensurately with that increase of productivity because the prices of the commodities
Yep.
becomes lower.
And also he mentions probably also a pretty obvious conclusion, but he mentions it anyways, which is the other thing they won't do. They definitely won't increase your wages, or at least they're going to resist that. They also definitely won't shorten the working day, right? That's not going to happen. Because that's something that Marx brings up. Could be, like, Marx brings this up as a possibility, right? That if we had, if we had a socialist organization where, we actually highly value free time not spent laboring, then we might consider our increase in productivity to be great because, hey, we get to work less, right? We can achieve more in less time, so let's just take the rest of the time to ourselves. Sounds great. Capitalists, absolutely not. That extra time that could be free time, that's actually our time. That's literally free labor. Like, you are not getting compensated for that at all. That is just pure surplus value, baby. So yeah, that's another thing he'll bring up here. And then I guess just so I gave my definitions here, but here's Marx's for the difference between absolute and relative. He says he calls surplus value that which is produced by lengthening the working day, and in contrast, the surplus value which arises from the curtailment of the necessary labor time and from the corresponding alteration in the respective lengths of the two components of the working day is relative surplus value. There you go. That's his definition here on 432. Let's see. Okay, next thing I wanted to call out here, this paragraph. While it's not our intention here to consider the way in which the immanent laws of capitalist production manifest themselves in the external movement of the individual capitals assert themselves, but as they assert themselves as the coercive laws of competition, and therefore enter into the consciousness of the individual capitalist as the motives which drive him forward, this much is clear. A scientific analysis of competition is possible only if we can grasp the inner nature of capital, just as the apparent motions of the heavenly bodies are intelligible only to someone who's acquainted with their real motions, which are not perceptible to the senses. Nevertheless, for the understanding of the production of relative surplus value, and merely on the basis of the results already achieved, we may add the following remarks, and then some more diatribing and thought experiment, which I kind of want to jump to the end here. So I think, to summarize this section real fast, I mean, he basically is, he's walking through this case study, right? Or like an example of this happening, this shortening of the necessary labor time and thus extending the surplus labor time. Okay, so to skip ahead, what he says here is, on the other hand, the working day of 12 hours is now represented for him by 24 articles instead of 12. So we're saying, what if the worker was twice as productive? Hence, in order to get rid of the product of one working day, the demand must be double what it was, and the market must become twice as extensive. So yeah, if your labor is more productive and you make, let's say 24 articles instead of 12, then in order to sell that, actually, I think I got it mixed up. This is an example of technology, right? Of like increasing productivity. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I got it mixed up. That's right. That was my next slide, I guess. So I'll get into this graph in a second. But he's basically, okay, imagine we introduce some technology or whatever that doubles our productivity. Great. Now we have twice as many things we need to sell. So he says, other things being equal, the capitalist commodities can only command a more extensive market if their prices are reduced. So in other words, right, if you want people to buy your stuff because you made more of it, then you should probably just lower its price and kind of box out your competition. Because people are going to typically they're going to gravitate towards the cheapest product, assuming they're relatively similar. He will therefore sell them above their individual, but below their social value, say at 10, whatever, each. By this means, he still squeezes an extra surplus value of 1 penny out of each. This augmentation of surplus value is pocketed by himself, whether or not his commodities belong to the class of necessary means of subsistence, and therefore participate in determining the general value of labor power. Hence, quite independently of this, there is a motive for each individual capitalist to cheapen his commodities by increasing the productivity of labor. Okay, so having said that Marx has laid out, capitalists want to increase the productivity of labor. But why? Okay. So I came up with this visual aid, hopefully is actually an aid and not just confusion. But let's say we've got two firms that are competing against one another in the same industry. So it doesn't really matter what they produce. But we can say that in this first period, they're basically kind of on the same productive capacity. Like they probably buy from similar raw material, producers. They probably hire similar laborers, of similar skill and so forth. So we would say that the socially necessary labor time here on the y-axis, don't worry about the numbers that much, they don't really matter, but so one could just be like 1 hour, right? Just pretend like, okay, in the beginning, producing whatever thing this is takes an hour, and for both of them they fluctuate around that hour, as things will tend to fluctuate in the market. There's going to be a little randomness going on, a little chaos, but typically they're going to be floating around that socially necessary labor time, represented by the dotted black line. The dotted black line in this idealized version, just imagine it as like it's an average of the blue line and the red line. So if we're pretending like firm A and firm B are the only two companies in the world that produce this thing, I don't know if anyone has an example of a perfect duopoly. I don't know if that exists, but let's just say these two companies are the only people in the world that make this article, this product, and it takes about an hour to make. Now, let's say that the firm A here, the blue line, they purchase or develop or some awesome new technology that doubles their productivity, meaning it takes half as much time. So the socially necessary labor time has gone down to half here. So the value, which is basically just this column, the value is half. Because this new machine is awesome, makes their workers more productive. So they have this period of time here where they have a serious competitive advantage, which is pretty much what Marx was just describing in that little section there. Because, let's read what he said again. He will therefore sell them above their individual, but below their social value. By this means, he still squeezes an extra surplus of 1 penny out. So, if the black dotted line is the social average, he can sell them below that, but above their individual value. So the blue line would be the individual value. It's how much the capitalist, or in other words, their workers, how much time they actually put into it. And so let's say it's half. It's half an hour, 30 minutes of labor time. But let's say the only other competitor in the space hasn't caught on yet, right? Maybe for a couple months here, they don't realize that their competition has just invented something awesome that makes them more productive. So the average of the blue line and the red line is still up here somewhere, which means anywhere in this region between the blue line and the dotted black line is where the firm A, the blue capitalist in this case, can sell anywhere in this region. And basically they're not breaking any rules of selling things at their value. In fact, they're selling things below their value. They're selling it below the social value, which is the dotted line, but above their individual. So somewhere in this region. And that makes a hell of a profit. Because you're selling something that was for a value that is equivalent to maybe 0.8 hours, but you're only producing it, in other words, paying your workers for 30 minutes of labor. So you're just getting a bunch of easy money, basically, in this period of time. But those pesky old coercive laws of competition eventually will catch up. The red corporation here will eventually figure out the production secret, the technology, whatever, and catch on. And they're eventually going to implement the same production techniques and catch up. And then what we'd say is that the social necessary labor time will just equilibrate back to a new social average of 30 minutes. Because remember, if we're just saying the average in this hypothetical is just between these two companies, then whatever the average is between them two is the social average. And so it started as an hour, some new technology came along, it drops to half an hour. And whichever company gets down to that half an hour first is going to have a nice period, some sweet competitive advantage. It might even be advantageous enough to completely box Red out of the market and maybe buy them out or leverage something. This happens all the time, right? You'll have a company basically edge out their competition and then use the huge influx of capital they just made to somehow hinder their competition, buy out the competition, basically permanently defeat them so that they're no longer a factor. That's how monopolies are made. But does anyone have any questions on this graphic? Because hopefully it's somewhat easy to understand, but I'm curious what you all think.
Definitely having a bit of a brain at the moment.
Does that mean it doesn't make sense, or?
Oh no! It does. I'm just, you know how potato brain goes.
Sure. Yeah. No, I think when I read this section, I was literally just, I swear I was like visualizing this type of graph. I'm like, oh, it's sort of like, it's Marx not using the language of like signal dampening or like attenuation, all this kind of stuff, which makes sense to me. And he's just using a lot of words to say what I think a picture can say pretty easily. But yeah, I mean, I think honestly, this is something that even modern day capitalists would totally agree with, right? I mean, I think this is like a no brainer for most people, most people or most capitalists. The part that they might not understand immediately would be this kind of social average. In other words, the value of the actual thing. So, because that's, if you think about it, right, the dotted line is kind of Marx's contribution to this, by explaining, like, you know, why this is even a competitive advantage, and why that works. But you know, that's kind of how pricing out your competition works, right? Is that you can sell things for cheaper than the social average, which everyone in the market will find attractive because they're like, wow, it's the same product, but it's literally just cheaper. Sounds great to me. Yeah, that typically cannot be sustained for too long, as you're just eventually, right? That social average will catch up eventually, and you will start to not make huge windfall profits anymore. But this same effect of reducing the socially necessary labor time for different products does have kickbacks on ultimately cheapening your labor force by making everything they need to survive more affordable. And so what Marx is getting at is that this drive, this coercive competitive stuff happening all the time between different firms, is, even if no one's individually conscious of it, like nobody's really thinking of it in those terms, over time, that's going to have the effect of making that necessary labor time shorter, as technology keeps advancing and increasing productivity across the board. So yeah, and then I guess I kind of back over here. I kind of hinted at this already. Page is this again? Oh, okay, yeah. Let's see. Let's jump here, I guess. The law of the determination of value by labor time, so this is his labor theory of value, makes itself felt to the individual capitalist who applies the new method of production by compelling him to sell his goods under their social value. This same law, acting as a coercive law of competition, forces his competitors to adopt the new method. The general rate of surplus value is therefore ultimately affected by the whole process only when the increase in the productivity of labor has seized upon those branches of production and cheapened those commodities that contribute towards the necessary means of subsistence and are therefore elements of the value of labor power. Again, I think hopefully this is pretty similar to what I just described in this figure, right? So on one hand, they're compelled to sell things below their social value. In other words, you're compelled to find either new ways of exploiting your labor, new technologies that make them more productive, etc., so that you can dip below the dotted black line. That is always your goal in order to dominate the market. But then he says, at the same time, everyone else wants to do that, right? So it's coercive. It's forcing everyone to do the same thing, and eventually the competitors adopt the same method. There you go. The Red company, yeah, they might get hoodwinked for a little bit here, but they're eventually going to figure it out and catch up because they're coerced to do so. And by the way, if anyone runs into the aggravating liberal talking point of, oh, but what about this good capitalist, right? What about this person I've worked for or that I know or something who treats their workers well and blah, blah, blah. Well, guess what, son? The laws of competition are pretty coercive. And as soon as someone else in your industry starts fucking around and exploiting their labor even more ruthlessly, well, then your nice, Red, let's say the Red company is the nice capitalist, quote unquote, they're going to get run out of town. They're going to get run out of business by the other company that acts in a more aggressive way and more ruthlessly exploits their laborers. So, yeah, you can be a nice capitalist, but not for very long, not indefinitely. You're either going to stay really fucking small or just get run out of business completely. And unfortunately, they don't really have a say in the matter. Even if they are like actually nice people who run a business, they're rare, but I guess, some people do exist like that, but they typically they aren't the ones that survive for very long. They are coerced into behaving in kind of like the most ruthless way they can.
I have definitely had more than one workplace that was a great place to work when I started. And then just as time goes on, due to just like changing pressures in the market, or one time they got acquired by another company who swore up and down that they weren't going to change anything and just let the new let us keep running the way that we always had, which is always a lie. That what was a great place to work very slowly, in a boiled frog sort of way, turned into a pretty toxic work environment.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people are probably familiar too with the almost impending doom of being acquired by like a VC firm, like venture capital or something. Yeah. Like even the most, I swear it's so funny to me because like even the most like reactionary dipshits, as soon as venture capital comes and like purchases their company, everyone panics. It's like, no, because they know, man. Like they internalize this shit. Like they know.
Like you're basically about to get fucking liquidated.
Yeah, exactly. Because guess what? Someone came in who is this ruthless motherfucker. right? They are the
Yeah.
blue line. They're the ones who's like gonna roll up their sleeves and start laying people off like it's literally their job, because it probably is.
Speaking of Office Space,
Yeah, true. Okay, skipping ahead a little bit here. This is the part I somewhat touched on also, because Marx, I guess, just has to address this for, to be a completionist, cover his bases, but shouldn't be that surprising to us that the shortening of the working day is by no means what is aimed at in capitalist production, when labor is economized by increasing productivity. It is only the shortening of the labor time necessary for the production of a definite quantity of commodities on hand that is aimed at. And the fact that the worker, when the productivity of his labor is increased, produces, say, 10 times as many commodities as before, and thus spends 1/10 of as much labor time on each, by no means prevents him from continuing to work 12 hours as before, nor from producing in those 12 hours 1,200 articles instead of 120. Indeed, his working day may simultaneously be prolonged as to make him produce, say, 1,400 in 14 hours. So, yeah. Shouldn't be shocking to us that even though we're increasing productivity and living standards are generally increasing, if you think that means we're going to be working less, you got another thing coming, because that is not happening. And also, yes, insert the productivity versus wage graph here, because I did not do that, but it does. It probably should be slotted right between 12 and 13, right? Because yes, that graph is just a direct consequence of this little spiel right here, right? That no matter how much productivity increases, unless capitalists are being forced to give wages or to, raise wages in response to increasing productivity, which is pretty rare and would almost certainly require state intervention. Yeah, it just doesn't happen that much. Pretty much never. So what increasing productivity tends to do is just increase surplus value, which only helps the capitalists and pretty much nobody else. Or at least I should say, the proportion to which it helps everyone is much smaller than the proportion it helps the capitalist. Because yes, even though your living standards are probably increasing gradually, and probably over, I know, like in the scale of human history, it might, on a graph, right, you would look at like 200 years of capitalist production and be like, wow, productivity has really spiked dramatically, and that's great in a lot of ways. But a lot of fucking people died to make that happen. And unfortunately, a lot of people that made that possible did not live to see the fruits of their labor, unfortunately. Many have, but a lot of people did not.
I just dropped the productivity versus pay gap, or the productivity pay gap link in the chat.
Oh, okay, yeah. Let's see here. Yes, there we go.
There are many versions of it. That's just the first one that turned up on Google.
Yep. So I think one way to interpret this is basically, during this period, we have fairly competent labor organizing. And I think what we could argue here is that the reason these lines are fairly lockstep for this period of time is we could basically say, well, pressure from unions and organized labor, and to a certain extent, legislation that had been pushed for by organized labor, like in the New Deal and all that jazz, you could say that basically labor was keeping up with capital, or at least had enough influence to force capital to keep increasing wages in proportion to their productivity. And then you have basically the Reagan era in the
Like
80s.
they put the line there in 1980, like very quietly being like, "Huh, wonder what happened here."
Yeah, so this is where you got your period of brutal anti-labor, not just legislation and court decisions, but also just straight up physical violence, basically, against labor demonstrations. Yeah, basically, it's like it literally is like the Empire Strikes Back. I mean, in very literal terms. Yeah, they kind of put the kibosh on labor organizing. It has been fairly crippled since, although looks like it's starting to pick up a little bit here since it's 2020, I guess. So yeah, it's getting a little better, but still an ocean of difference here. We got like a almost 50% split.
Yeah.
Pretty sick. Okay, let's get to 13 here. 13 is a pretty fun chapter about cooperation and how it is very characteristic within capitalism. The fact that, so he initially he starts out here by basically saying, right, we may have started out in a very, like, rewind the clock. We had manufacturing and handicrafts, which would have been done by workers in guilds or even at their home, and typically was on kind of a small scale of production. But then you start seeing the early stages of capitalist production where you have these workshops where there'd be one master or one capitalist who owns the workshop and all the tools in it, and the handicraftsmen or the manufacturers would come to the workshop and use the tools to do their thing, build their stuff, and either give a portion of it to the capitalist or just straight up give all of it to the capitalist, and the capitalist gives. This is also how wage labor gets started, is that instead of taking your products home with you with the intention of selling them in the market, you just end up giving all your products to the capitalist at the end of the day, and the capitalist gives you a nice little wage, so you can just take the money into the market instead to go buy what you need. And basically what Marx is getting at here is, a classic quantitative change culminating in qualitative change. A nice little dialectical development there. And eventually, right, this will lead to large scale labor workforces and labor like armies of labor, as I think the analogy goes. I think we also have in here, he'll talk about how, as an example of, like, this dude says that, if you take kind of any old 5 farm laborers, they're pretty much going to be the same as any other 5 farm laborers. And indeed, that when your workforce increases to a certain scale, suddenly all of the kind of the talk, and the terms that Marx uses of like social averages and social this and social that actually become more of a reality, because when you have a big old honking workforce, you become a little less concerned with like a couple people slacking off, because chances are there's a couple people who are working extra hard, and you'll find that basically as your workforce grows over time, that you actually get closer and closer to a average labor power. All right, well, but yeah, you're basically as you you could think of it as like as your workforce increases, each person's contribution is approaching the social average. So you can basically think of it that way. I think he says at the end here that the law of valorization therefore comes fully into its own for the individual producer only when he produces as a capitalist and employs a number of workers simultaneously, and when from the outset of he sets in motion labor of a socially average character. So again, he's talking about this stuff in terms of a historical development. So you're right, that transition from like handicrafts and work like small workshops into like these big old honking factories, with supply chains and the whole mess of it. So there's the historical development of it, but then there's also just sort of the theoretical development of it that kind of would have to follow a similar progression. So yeah, I guess that's basically what he's making of that argument here. Oh, okay, yeah. So what I summarized here is capitalist production is kind of takes off in earnest once it's reached a certain scale of lots of workers, lots of means of production, a large output, and then when you get to these these larger scales of production, it's actually more accurate to use these average values, and they tend to describe economies of scale pretty well, whereas smaller individual cases are going to have more variance. And this is like, honestly, this is like super basic statistics in a lot of ways. I mean, Marx isn't saying using that language, but I can tell you he's basically describing basic ass statistics, right? It's like the larger your data set is, more confident you can be in your I mean, when you have a smaller sample set, you might have larger variance between data points, for example. Once you have like a huge data set, that variance is gonna feel like much more insignificant, and that it's much more accurate, or it's going to be more and more accurate to use the average value, describe the whole process. All right, next for cooperation, he's going to talk a bit about just different kinds of cooperation, I guess, that you might expect to find. So, for example, we can have cooperation within a certain labor discipline or separate disciplines, for example. So, like different types of labor. You can also achieve things through cooperation that an individual laborer could not achieve. So he gives the example, I think, of like carrying bricks up a ladder. So if you have one person carry bricks up the ladder, they're going to have to grab one brick. I'm thinking like a cinder block, like probably a big old brick. They grab a cinder block, climb up the ladder, put the cinder block up on the roof, and then climb back down, get another one, blah, blah, blah. Whereas if you have one person on the ground, let's say like OSHA hasn't been invented yet, so let's say you have two people on the ladder and one guy on the roof, and you just make a little chain of like handing off the brick up the ladder. Then each person only has to basically move the brick like 2 or 3 feet at a time, and they also don't need to move. They can just stand there and just pass the bricks along. And they're you can achieve a much higher productivity of just moving things. Simple work equals force times distance equation, So but also I think he gives the example of like, it doesn't matter how strong you are, like one person can't possibly, lift I don't know, some super heavy object, a car. I don't know why a bunch of people need to go carry cars around. It doesn't typically happen, but one person would have a very hard time picking up a car by themselves. But if you got like 10 people, I'm pretty sure 10 people could probably pick up a car and move it around without too much stress. So again, just some simple examples of how combining and cooperating with your labor can achieve a lot more than just one person on their own. He's another way you can do it. He says is you can break down your production into many different steps of simple labor. So this is commonly, I think, called like, or at least I remember being taught this in history class, of like the Henry Ford method, right? Which I always find was weird that it was like the assembly line version of production, which I'm like, yeah, maybe Henry Ford just did it really well because he was a ruthless bastard, but I'm pretty sure it was done before him, because Marx is literally describing it like way before Ford was around. In fact, it wouldn't shock me that much if Henry Ford like read Marx and was like, damn, this guy's got some great ideas. I'm gonna go be a fucking Nazi and do this. Anyways, yeah.
Talk about taking away the wrong lesson.
Yeah, right. I know, it's like, honestly, I feel like a few of these chapters in here could just be like a practical guide to being an evil bastard by Karl Marx.
I mean, you get a lot of commentary about the most brutal and effective capitalist usually started off as a former communist.
Yeah, I mean, at that point, it is almost like a just moral failing. I feel like I'm just like, you learned you learned the right things and applied it in the worst way possible.
It's kind of like when I was originally trying to figure out which print edition to purchase, and like looking at reviews, mostly just like looking for indicators that chapters had been removed or abridged or whatever. But you'd see the occasional review like, this is a must read if you consider yourself a capitalist, you have to know your enemy. And I'm like, no, that's wrong.
I mean, will actually say, from that perspective, I would encourage it. I would say, yeah, learn from us. Learn what the communists have, and there's at least a non-zero chance of them being like, oh wow, I might be a bad person. Maybe I should not be a capitalist.
That's true. I found that so funny.
You put too much faith in their ability for self-reflection.
That is true. A lot of people have absolutely zero self-awareness.
But some people have a shred of self-awareness. So it's a numbers game. I have to have at least some baseline faith that if more people in the world read Capital, we would have more communists. I'm pretty sure that's true.
Fair. It amused me that literally every version that I looked at had some review under it to that effect.
Yeah. In fact, I mean, even if you're not interested in like the whole capitalism versus socialism versus communism thing at all, I feel like just some of these chapters about like, especially the ones we're going to get to, about like technological development and how that affects like the human economy, it's actually really fascinating. It's just like, even from a historical perspective, it's pretty cool.
I mean, there's definitely some stuff in here that would not have been out of place in some of my, especially graduate level economics and economic policy classes.
For sure. And I mean, so again, this is probably be left for people who know way more than I do about those types of disciplines, but like, I hear, like, for example, I hear David Harvey and even like Richard Wolff types of where they're like, yeah, there's no Marxists in academia, and like everyone is like scared of mentioning Marx and all of his ideas. But I'm like, they can't completely avoid it. Like, some of this stuff is just literally so basic. I don't see how you could possibly avoid like the implications of technology. It seems he was pretty on the money for that stuff.
Forward.
Yeah, Marx was pretty on the money with that stuff.
especially when you start looking at things like, well, both A, technology transfer, and B, technology leapfrogging within developing economies, that is a really good, like, concrete example of ways that you can get that sort of that that gap between the cost of production and the socially necessary labor cost, where you can get that competitive gap. And the way that you've been able to see growth within within the economies of places like Korea and China, and even a little bit in like Brazil, South Africa, India, where the technological capacity of their economies developed later than those at what you would kind of consider sort of the first world or the imperial core, in such a way that they were able to undercut manufacturing in places like Europe and the United States, both because of a cheaper cost of labor and because they started out at a technologically more advanced place and didn't have to make the, I guess, additional capital investments over sunk costs of older technology. And that's a big field of study of this kind of technological leapfrogging, in what they would kind of consider like BRICS nations, developing economies, things like that.
Yeah, that is pretty interesting. Which, by the way, is also part of the impetus for like wanting to take our time a little more with chapters 14 and 15, because there is some pretty juicy stuff in there that I think is worth our time. We shouldn't just like, because like, I'm trying to use, obviously I can only really use my own reading, my pace of reading as like a judge, as a guide. But yeah, like even I have like, I'm not like totally falling behind, but at the same time as the readings are getting longer, the chapters are also getting more interesting, and I want to like dive into them more. So it's a compounding problem.
Yeah,
right? That's what the problem.
Yeah, and I'm totally cool with that, because there is some really good stuff, like some really juicy stuff in chapter 14.
Exactly. Yeah, it's like the content is getting more dense, and we're reading more content. So it's like, okay, now we should probably just slow down for our own sake, really, and also just give ourselves some more time to actually digest the text instead of like flying through chapters and then just being like, what the fuck did I just read? That's obviously part of the reason of, reading the chapters, because I mean, my process, I'll just go, like, I read it basically once through, and then with as much time as I have left, I'll go through again and find the places where I'll put my sticky notes of like, okay, read this paragraph or like read this section or something. And like, yeah, for this week, I feel like there's good reason to make a little ultra basic PowerPoint of just like summarizing some of these points, and also compressing them, because I feel like a lot of what's in here is not groundbreaking, but Marx does love using his words. So
yeah, he has some kind of like meandering examples where I kind of felt myself, like my brain going a little bit numb, where I'm like, okay, I realize you're being thorough, but this is also just like really obvious.
Exactly. And that's the thing. I feel like he's explaining like basically simple algebra with a very lengthy word problem. That's how I like to think of it. It's like those. It's literally like those middle school algebra problems where it's like x plus 2 equals 4. What is x? But it's that to like some
3 pages.
Yeah, it's that with some like really elaborate example, and instead of using round numbers, he's using whatever the fuck the English currency system was. Holy crap.
Yeah, before they went to like a decimal currency. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I'm not even gonna bother researching what the fuck, a shilling is, or I'm not interested.
Because how many pence there was to a shilling and how many shillings there were to a pound was some really weird ratio, and it wasn't static throughout history. It varied. So like I can't even tell you off the top of my head what the numbers are, because in Marx's time, I think that ratio was different to like what it was in the 50s, like right before they went to the kind of more I think they went to like the decimal system in the 60s maybe, or maybe in the 70s. It's fairly recent.
Right. Okay, another here for so 46. I don't remember if David Harvey mentions. I think he did. But another, because I know he's interested in like obviously he's a geographer by training, so I know this stuff interests him. But Marx also talks about how the cooperation allows work to be carried on over a larger area. So for certain labor processes, the object of labor is just like large areas of land. So you get, draining of marshes, construction of dikes, irrigation, canals, roads, railways. Again, these are all large scale projects that would take a single individual just an unfathomable amount of time to complete on their own. So, get fucked libertarian weirdos who want some freaky dystopia of everyone doing their own thing that is silly. Anyways, so while extending the scale of production, it renders possible a relative contraction of its arena, the simultaneous restriction of space, and extension of effectiveness allows for a large number of incidental expenses to be spared from the massing together of workers of various labor processes from the concentration of the means of production. So, again, this is like a David Harvey thing. He loves doing this, but like understanding how capital uses, physical space itself to increase cooperation, increase efficiency of the labor process, and also extend its productive capacity. I think in the very next paragraph here, he also talks about how the combined working day produces a greater quantity of use values than an equal sum of isolating days, and consequently diminishes labor time necessary for the production of each of a given useful effect. Or wait, is that the one I was thinking of? Yeah. I think that's whatever. Basically, jump back here, back in my notes. I think I might have skipped ahead to this real quick, but I think what he's getting at here is this other effect. This is where I think oh no, that's actually here. Okay, we have another classic twofold nature of the process of production. So again, this is where Marx loves pointing out some dual dialectic nature thing going on. So on one hand, I think what he can this is the part I'm actually interested in looking at, but he sets it up on 450. But he talks about how the worker is the owner of his labor power until he's finished bargaining for its sale. He can sell no more than what he has. So, in other words, one worker is only capable of negotiating for his own labor power. Well, we're just pretending like unions don't exist right now, but let's just go with it for now. This relation between capital and labor is no way altered by the fact that the capitalist, instead of buying the labor power of one man, buys out of 100 and enters into separate contracts with 100 unconnected men instead of one. And then he can set the 100 men to work, letting them or without letting them cooperate. In which case you're just paying 100 people basically to work in isolated workbenches or something. And eventually they'll cooperate with one another and in the labor process and all that. But basically what he ends up saying is the socially productive power of labor develops as a free gift to capital whenever the workers are placed under certain conditions, and it is capital which places them under these conditions. And because this power costs capital nothing, while on the other hand it is not developed by the worker until his labor belongs to capital, it appears as a power which capital possesses by nature, its nature, a productive power inherent in capital. So because capital can get 100 people to work on one project together by essentially coercing 100 people to do so, they're all going to be brought together on this big cooperative project. Whether it be just produce a bunch of random shit or maybe one large piece of shit, whatever. Essentially, what I think the way I worded it is that the enhanced productivity from a cooperative workforce is not reflected in the higher wages but it is instead entirely for the benefit of the capitalist. Because the capitalist pays workers as individuals for their specific labor power. But in real production, in other words, the labor process, they're actually working together and they achieve more together than their labor powers added together individually. Thus, higher levels of cooperation can actually increase the degree of exploitation for all workers involved. And the way Marx puts that is that, I think he makes it seem, he's basically saying that it appears or it seems like this is something capital does, when in reality it's something that the laborers do. And what's one of our our most common memes is socialism is when no iPhone. Right? We hear this all the time of, if you wanted socialism, you would never have the iPhone because an iPhone is from a capitalist organization, company. And what is the classic rebuttal is, no, you idiot. Workers made the fucking iPhone. Laborers did. Not the fucking Steve Jobs or whatever. Right? Even Steve Jobs himself didn't do shit. Apparently he just stole everything from fucking Steve Wozniak or whatever. So, yeah.
Capitalism determines who gets paid, not who does the work. Or not, well, I guess it decides who does the work too, but...
Yeah.
Capitalism decides who gets paid. But it's labor who actually did the work.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, if work was done, a worker probably did the work. Unsurprising, I know, but apparently it's a hard thing for a lot of people to grasp. But yeah, and I think Marx is illuminating why this meme exists. I know it's weird to say that, but in some ways he's almost predicting this sort of meme arising, because he's saying, yeah, some people, it appears, if you don't think about it very hard, if you're just an uncritical thinker, you would appear that, the iPhone was produced by what? Not by worker, not by labor, by capital. That's the meme. That is the meme.
The capitalist is saying, hey, you'd have never come up with this thing if I hadn't put you all in the same room together.
Exactly. And that is something that capital intentionally propagandizes around. They know that is like a fallacy, that is not actually true, but that it looks kind of true. They know that it's deceptive, and they use it to their advantage. by saying like, oh, without us, none of this would be possible. And it's like, no, bullshit. Like, it's only possible because of the working class, not because of fucking capital.
Well, and the proof that they know that that's not true is that, like, they have like those intellectual property clauses in employment contracts about like, hey, anything you come up with while you're working here is ours.
Don't forget
Exactly.
non-compete clauses, which are also vile.
Also, isn't there remember that clip of after Bezos launched his dick rocket into like orbit or whatever, and he's in that interview, he's like, I'd like to thank like all the employees at Amazon, like without whose contribution to this, this wouldn't be possible. In a weird way, I kind of think Bezos is like pretty class conscious. Again, he's just like we were talking about earlier. He's class conscious in the worst way possible, where he's like very conscious of how much he exploits everyone, but he's like, yeah, that's a good, like, I like to do that.
Yeah,
because it
yeah.
affords me the ability to fucking go into space whenever I want. It's like, oh, just
He said that, and I'm like, yes, but oh my god.
yeah, it's like it's self-aware evil is just like so cringe.
Yeah, like you almost would prefer the kind of evil that does not realize that it's evil.
So like Musk, like he's the other. I feel like he's the one who like
he
is.
Fucking knows.
I don't know. I feel like
fucking knows.
He might, but he gives the vibe of his head is way up his own ass. Like, oh, I am the greatest. I am the guy. I am like, you know what I mean?
Love me or else.
Usually.
You're right. That might be just a facade. It's very possible.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Every now and then he has like a mask off moment where you're like, no, he absolutely knows what kind of shitty human being he is, and he does not care.
That's fair. That's fair. Okay. I must have skipped. I don't remember which page. I must have just flipped past it. It's not a big. We don't even need to really get into the text crazy, but the other aspect of organization, of course, or cooperation, when you do get to larger workforces and big operations, that means the capitalists more incentivized to hire supervisors, managers to organize discipline, coordinate labor to maintain heightened productivity. In likewise, a more socialized labor force that works together is more likely to organize and resist the domination of capital, which in turn increases capital's repression, etc. Ensue, class struggle intensifies.
On 449, by the way, because I actually did make a note in the margins that said class struggle. So you said that, and I'm like, oh, I know where that is.
Okay. Thank you. I was like,
yeah.
I know it's like it's one of these fucking paragraphs.
Yeah, because he started. Yeah, well, and also like the thing about the number of cooperating workers increases, and so does the resistance to domination of capital. That's like right where I wrote that.
Yep.
And it goes on 450 where he talks about like the managers and the foremen and compares them to like an army.
Correct. Yeah, he used that analogy a lot, and it makes sense. I think the military hierarchy, which really is almost completely unchanged since like time in memoriam, I feel like, is
a kind of top-down organization.
Yeah, like a very rigid kind of chain of command almost type structure is pretty much what capital has adopted as a hierarchical organization apparatus. But I think right before we started recording, Ithar and I were also talking about this, though. Another classic example of the snake eating its own ass, where I think in the modern day, I don't know if this would have been as common in Marx's day, probably not, but I think nowadays we find that administrative bloat has basically gotten to the point where, these office, the managers, supervisors this entire apparatus of like, I think some other people, even though I don't think it's necessarily like a class unto itself, it's like a subclass of proletariat, but like the quote unquote professional managerial class, right? Of this of
Yeah.
this large group of the workforce, and it's gotten larger over time, who do not do any quote unquote productive labor, in the sense that like they're not the ones making the shit or performing the service themselves, but they're sort of facilitating it. So it could be anything from facilitating payments, shipments, HR, IT. And then of course, those are all like support staff, I guess I'm listing. But there's also, of course, just straight up managers who they either like project managers who like oversee one small portion of the labor of the production process, or you might have supervisors might oversee like multiple project teams or whatever. Obviously it'll vary depending on your industry. It's hard to talk in generalities, but everyone's sort of familiar with what I'm talking about, which is like this very bloated administration, like bureaucracy that has arisen through this need to organize and discipline labor. And the irony is that at least we were talking about this earlier, is that like I feel like at least I've seen it a lot in my case. I'm sure other people are very familiar with the idea of like eventually the admin and the bureaucracy of all becomes a hindrance to productivity as opposed to a boon. Like even from the capitalist perspective, which is kind of ironic, right? Because it's another classic case of like capital needing, following its internal drives and motivations to like constantly increase productivity and get the most out of its workers. Usually, if not always, will eventually end up undermining that objective by just overdoing it in one way, or more than likely lots of different ways. That kind of administrative hierarchical bloat is at least one way in which I think that also manifests.
I almost feel like on the week that you said that you weren't going to be here, we should that one off week where we weren't sure what we were going to do, have a movie night and watch Office Space.
Honestly, that or freaking Chicken Run.
Chicken Run?
Totally
Chicken
forgot
Run.
about that. I totally forgot about that. Yeah, I don't know. Office Space is a freaking classic, though.
I'm not even picturing what Chicken Run is.
Aggressively Marxist. It's the one done by the Wallace and Gromit folks.
Okay, that's what I was just thinking. I was like, is this like a Wallace and Gromit spinoff?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I still can't.
It is kind of a weird movie. I find myself at a loss of words to explain it. Other than that, I absolutely know what you were talking about.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah.
I think I've seen it, but it's been a fucking minute. So
Yeah.
I was probably very young when I saw that, and probably had picked up on absolutely none of the Marxist commentary. But yeah, I guess that I'm sure Nikolai would also be down for an Office Space watch party. I'm sure he could help host it as well. But yeah, it's a solid idea. Week off. But let's see. I think that's mostly what I got for the cooperation chapter. Again, there's more in here about like, I think he's talking about like harvesting crops, for example. Like you have to harvest crops within a very narrow time window, for example. And so if it's just like one farmer or like two farmers at a time, they literally cannot work enough hours in the day to successfully harvest all the crops within a certain window of time. So you absolutely need a larger cooperative workforce to get out there and like systematically pick the fields in a narrow range of time. couple days or whatever, whenever the harvest is just right. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of situations that we're pretty familiar with, in which cooperation is just pretty normal. I feel like it's pretty a standard part of capitalist production. But and he does mention here, I think at the end, right, that like cooperation is the fundamental form of capitalist mode of production, although in its simple shape it continues to appear as one of the particular form, or as one particular form alongside. Yeah, so he's basically saying that like a cooperation is one of those funny, well, I guess it is kind of the basis of another contradiction of capital, because if I'm remembering from the David Harvey book correctly, I think there's a chapter that is basically this chapter from Capital, where it's like the contradiction between like socialized labor and privatized gain or privatized wealth, right? Because that's like a classic contradiction. It's, we work together as workers and as a large scale, because nowadays the economy is so globalized, like you don't really know just how many people are involved in whatever type of production you do, whatever your job is. Even if it's even if you just work in like computer science or IT, like, and kind of do a solo job, even then you don't really interact with like the coal, the people mining coal out in West Virginia and then burning it to provide you with power. Like technically that is someone in your supply chain that's giving, making your capability to do your job possible. So cooperation on a large scale is, I think, one of the most impressive things that human beings actually can achieve. It's just a tragedy that it is almost entirely exploited for the gain of a remarkably small minority of people. That's got to be one of the all-time tragedies of capitalism. And even if you do kind of grant those like minor points of like, yeah, I get it, capitalism has increased the standard of living for a lot of us, significantly more than it was a couple hundred years ago or whatever. The cost of that in terms of what we don't have, and also the just raw environmental damage, is pretty fucking steep. It's a pretty freaking steep cost. It's a pretty raw deal that I don't think anyone in their right mind would actually rationally accept. So that's the challenge, is to try and get people to actually realize the crumbs they get from the table is not the end all be all. And we can do better than that.